Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. Our my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. This is a very special episode because aboard the mothership is Simon Franglen. He's the composer for Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Come aboard as we go traversing the stars.
Hello, Mr. Franglen. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here, Jeff.
Well, it's a great honor to speak with you, sir. You're a fantastic composer, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
So I always start off with a question of inspiration. What inspired your love for music and who are your earliest influences?
I think the love for music came from my family. I had that built into my family. Music was always important for us, and I think that's one thing. Hopefully, music is still important as a medium. I think it transmits emotion better than most other things. There's that weird thing that music and smell are the two. Like they sound and smell, the things that resonate with us most. And that's always been something that I've loved. So when I was 13, I wrote to the BBC. I said, how do I become a record producer? And I'm pretty well unemployable doing anything else. It's very, very simple. I can only do this.
So on the first Avatar film, you worked with the legendary James Horner, as well as with Titanic and some other films you worked with him on. So what was the experience like working with him, and what did you learn about film composing from him?
Well, James was my closest friends, and we got on. I was more, devastated when he died. What James taught me, I think, was the idea that theme is important, that melody and flow are an important part of a score. That I tend to go for more melodic, thematic score writing rather than, say, churn and chug, although there is quite a lot of that in this score, because one of the things that we did on this score is Jim asked me to write. He said, look, I want to carry the heritage of James with me. And so we had themes that were important to Avatar 1, which I hopefully have brought in. And we wanted to continue using those through the series. The idea is this is a canon of films, so that you couldn't just make this a standalone score. No more than the sound. I think is you can hear the sound was connected, and my role in the first one was that idea of what made the non-orchestral elements unique, the sort of glowing Pandoran textures and the rhythms and stuff. But I think James Horner. Themes were really important and emotional, and the way that you flow in, emotionally in terms of cue. I think that's the thing. I've carried that with me. Though this is a new score, I hope people will say that I've carried on the heritage, even if it is, it's a new score, and I hopefully they like the fact that Jim and I made a conscious effort to bring some of the themes forward with us.
Well, like I said, you were a significant part of the first Avatar film as well. You wrote the lyrics to the song "I See You," which was one of the big songs from the first Avatar film, and it has the lines in it, "I live through you and you through me." So how did you use those lines to encapsulate that first film?
I think the idea there was that you had that connection between Jake and Neytiri. There was very much this idea that there was the ICU, that connection that was between them, and that they were greater than each other. And I think that their love was greater than just any one thing, and that the idea that he could die and still be connected, I think. And that the Pandora then allows him to the rebirth. I think that was part of the way that we were thinking about it.
So when you were composing the lyrics to the first film, did you already know for a fact that you were taking part in the second film, and did you put together the foundation for what you would think about in the second film for music?
At that time, James Horner had been hired to compose the scores for Avatar 2 on onwards. So that was 2009 when we finished the first one. 2015, he died. And I was working, I then had to take over finishing and delivering the music for the theme park. So there was 5 hours of music for the theme park to write. That finished in the summer of 2017. And then in December 2017, Jim phoned me up and said, come and read the scripts for the sequels. And on the very first page of Avatar 2, or the Avatar 2 script, as it was then, it wasn't called The Way of Water at that point, there is the first paragraph says, Neytiri sings the Songcord. And it has this sound, it has a feeling of being an ancient melody, but it also has the warmth of a mother's love. And so that I could see that he would, there were other things throughout the script where music had been written into the script, and it was an important element. And I think that was the thing, was that rather than music just being something that is separate from the film, in Way of Water, music is very integrated into the flow. Almost the first thing you see is Neytiri singing the Songcord, and the idea that the Songcord is a way you remember your ancestors and your present family, and as a life goes through, then the Songcord is there. And lyrically, I looked at different cultures around the world, and there was this repeated idea of a spark, it being that life was a spark at the beginning, and then the dawn, and the light grew, and then you carried that light with you through the day until you take that light to the sunset as you die. And I used that as the lyrical flow for the Neytiri song, for the Songcord, because that was the sort of core of it. And then she's obviously singing about the birth of her son, Nateum. And that's the idea, is that there is this spark and she's carrying that light. And so that was the first thing that I had to write for Avatar, for The Way of Water. And once I started working on that in early 2018, I wrote the theme, I wrote the lyrics in Na'vi because I wanted them to be connected to the planet. It needed to feel like it was indigenous to the planet, and it couldn't just be an English pop song chucked on the top. And so I did this, the writing of that. And then we got Zoe to do the performance as part of the filming. And I think one of the things you see is when you see the film, that performance you see on the screen is the live performance of her singing that vocal. We did not pre-record it. We did it live. She did it in front of 100 crew, and that's her singing it live with a boom mic over here. It's an astonishing thing because there's so much emotion. It's really a very, very special moment. So that became a core theme, the idea of Songcord. Then I took and made it into the family theme orchestrally. And that was my first way into the score.
Now, as you said, Zoe Saldana does the music for Songcord. She's, as far as I can tell, she's not an experienced singer. Does that play into how you approached which lyrics, music, and tone you were going for the song?
There are two things. One is that although she's not experienced, she's done a musical before. She's done a musical film before, and she was a very good singer. You can hear in the vocal. What you hear on screen is her. But I did want to make sure that I needed to give it a tactile quality, that it was something that could be sung round a campfire, but they could also be expanded into something more. So I couldn't make it into it had to have an intimacy. It had to be like a little prayer in some ways. A lullaby and a prayer, and was the way that Jim and I talked about it at the same time. And yes, but very much you need to make sure that your song reflects the person who's going to sing it. That was the most important thing. And we knew that Neytiri needed to sing it on screen. Then the problem was that Na'vi is the least useful language in the world to sing. It's up there with Klingon and Vogon as being just atrocious, because it has K's and X and T's and things like that. So I had to then choose my words, my translations carefully, and the lyrics carefully, so that I ended up with something that could actually flow. Now, there is one advantage with Na'vi, which is that you can say I to the shops will go rather than I am going to the shops. You can move some of the words around a bit. And then I worked with Paul Frommer just to make sure that I'd absolutely nailed it in terms of the translation. Paul Frommer being the man who created the Na'vi language. And that became, starting from there was the idea of the family. And then in the score, there are other major thematic ideas that were important to Jim. He said he wanted a more thematic score than the first one, although the first one has some phenomenal themes. He said that the idea of things being, the themes were less connected to characters and to and to things. They were more generic. Not generic isn't the right word. More general in terms of their scope. And he said he wanted a theme for the family. He wanted a theme for the Metcaina, and I evolved that into the theme for the Metcaina that was their connection to the sea as well. He wanted a theme for Payakan, the great Tulkun whale that we see. And I use that for the Payakan and for the Tulkun. And he wanted a theme for Kiri, the Sigourney Weaver character. And he wanted something for the RDA, for the baddies. He said, we don't have an Imperial March. And so, although, I've got, there is a particular thing, and there's a subset of that for Quaritch as well. So the Quaritch has something that is for him. And so these were the sort of things that he was saying to me is let's refine where we're going. And then he wanted the action music to be slightly more muscular. It was a direction to me. There was one point where I'd written one big action cue, 5-6 minutes long, gave it to him, and he went, yeah, it's great. And then he came back a couple of weeks and said, yeah, I've done some slicing, and this bit you did earlier, I like it, and could you do this, and so on. And this is the way you work with Jim, is Jim is constantly pushing you to get the stuff better and more where his vision was. And he just said to me, I like this, I want this to have a bit more of this feel. And so I then had to rewrite my 5 or 6 minutes and so on. And that was a regular occurrence. He would like something, he'd live with it, and then he'd refine it and say to me, no, try this. And invariably, where Jim goes, Jim has the best sense of where the music for a James Cameron film should be, which does make my life a little easier because I'd only have one boss.
So I think my favorite part of the entire score that I heard was Into the Water. I think that's my favorite piece. It's beautiful. It's complex. It denotes so many things. I thought, at least to my mind, it had peace, wonder. There's a little bit of melancholy in there. This great majesty as well. How did you find the essence of that song? And was there a particular note or instrument that you built upon to create it?
Yeah, that's interesting you talk about that because there was two specific things there. One that you'll hear that theme also used in The Return of the Tulkun. It's the same theme. And I also use it in Way of Water in a slightly, they have this ba-da-da-da-da, ba-da-da. They use that in a variation, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But I wanted the idea of a siren's call. It's almost like the mermaids singing Come Into the Water. And that was where my head was. I thought, right, so I used these voices almost to be like this idea of voices calling you and saying, come and be with us. And now in this case, they're not going to drown you and send you to your death. But it is the idea of there was this, the beauty and the siren call as you went through into the water was an important part for me. And I used the phenomenal Grace Davidson is the voice that she multi-tracked. We multi-tracked her many times to get that sectional. There's two sections of vocals, so there's a 2-part line, and she sang both of those, and we placed them because I wanted an intimacy that you don't get if you put 20 singers on there. When you have a few, just in this case, one voice, and you multi-track it, you get this needed to have a tactile quality to it. And then the other thing that Jim said to me is, I want the sense of the iridescence of the water, the light coming through the water and hitting the sand. And we talked about this and this either the glistening bubbles. And we made a texture with the percussionists in Los Angeles. I record the score in LA at the Newman stage. And we took a load of mark trees, but we didn't go the things you normally do. And some key hanging keys. We put everything we could find that was sort of like glistening texture. And then I made them play these randomly, so that we just played, instead of playing, if you take a mark tree as being a line of little bells, metal tubes that you can hit, normally people just go and you get this sort of long glisten. Instead, we said play randomly, just play individual ones, almost like, so you're almost playing like hanging chimes that you have in the garden, but high up. And there's this texture of this sort of glistening glow, which I wanted to be the bubbles. And then, so we now have the voices of the sirens, and we have this sense of the water iridescing. And then the part of this was finding that balance so that it flowed with we see Cirea swimming and her brother Arno, and they're so elegant and they flow so beautifully in the water. I wanted that to be them. And then we've got this sort of slightly, I know, uncomfortable feeling of the Omitakaya kids, of Loak and Natayem and Tuk and Kiri, although they suddenly look around and there's this wonder, but they're not yet there in terms of their being the water babies that we have elsewhere. If I think is the way to say. Does that explain? And then obviously we get big fish and we get wonder and we get all.
I mean, the one thing I can't help but think as I'm listening to the score, which was absolutely beautiful. So for the listeners, definitely get it. It's a wonderful score. Is that Avatar 2 is in a weird position that is unique among that. There's a third and a fourth and a fifth that you're pretty much guaranteed to come. So when you're making a great piece like Into the Water, are you holding things back? Are you kind of like doing something to, you're going to be building upon it in later films?
There are things in this score that are the beginning of a development. Because Jim said to me, you have to read all 4 scripts. And there's a reason for that. And so, because you have to understand the story arc of the characters you're writing for. And also the story arc for, how that affects you musically. There are things here in 2 that will come to fruition later in the series, or, we'll start to see how things develop. And that is very much one of the things that we've done in this. There are things that are simple here that will become more complex as we go through. There are things here that will be repeated. The idea of motifs is going to continue. There are new characters in 3. I've already written stuff for 3 because we were working on 2 and 3 in parallel from 2018 onwards. So although I've not got into the heart of the score yet, I've already written music for 3 as well. And that it was important to Jim that everything that we do is coherent, just as the actors need to know their arc so they know where they're going to go. He wanted the same thing for me. He said, I need you to know where we need to be here so that you can understand where we need to start from.
How excited must it be then to already know what's coming in the third one as well? I mean, when you're doing the second movie, are you getting overly excited, like, I gotta do this for the third script or the fourth script because I've read that, I got this stuck in my head, I gotta write it out?
There are some things I can tell you that there's stuff in the third script that I love, and there are all these things that you sit there going, oh God, why don't I just let everybody hear it now? And you go, because for the same reason that Jim isn't allowing us, he's not giving away the whole game now. So there are things in 3. I mean, 3 is phenomenal. I know everybody, I've heard other people talk about, like Jim and Sam and Zoe and so on, have all talked about what 3 is amazing, and it really is genuinely absolutely amazing. And I think two is it's this weird thing, whereas one was more about discovering Pandora, and then it's Jake and Neytiri. But there is that scale of the Pandoran side of things. You get 1,000 Ikran flying down and attacking 100 helicopters and so on. This is still a big movie. Nobody in their right minds would call this small. But at the heart of it, there is that idea of family. I think is something that is very easy for all of us to that resonates. And I think what Jim said to me was, we need this score it needs to have that sense of the family needs to be the most important thing here. And there were certain cues where he said to me, if we don't have them all crying in the cinema at this point, then we haven't done our job right. And there's one particular cue where I wrote it. I'm going, this is great. It's like 5-minute cue. And he goes, yeah, oh, this is really good. Okay, that's fine. 2 weeks later, and said, yeah, I think you can do better. and so I rewrite it. And then a few days later, he said, well, give it to me. Let me put it in the Avid. So he puts it in the Avid, and then, nah, you can still do better. And then I played it to him the third time. So I've now written 15 minutes of music for this one cue to get this 5 minutes. And this is the regular thing of every composer has to do this. And I knew that I started it, and he started to cry. And I got him to the end, and I thought, okay, now if I can get him to cry the whole way through the cue, then we're there. And he said, yeah, you've nailed it. And so that's I'll take it from Jim.
That is awesome. And like I said, this movie is going to be probably the biggest in the world for weeks to come. When can our listeners get a hold of the soundtrack?
I'm hoping as soon as possible. One of the problems was that we finished so late. As you know, there are certain of the awards we just not been eligible for because we weren't able to get it out to actually for people to actually hear the score and see the film because there was such an embargo. We finished 5 days before the British premiere. But I mean, to give you an idea, I just received these today, so you're the first person to see this.
Nice.
Just to give an idea of the scale of. This is the finished score.
Wow.
There are that's I've never quite received that much music from writing for a film, but that's not all the cues. That's all the cues on the film that actually in the film. There's probably double. There's probably double this in things I've written elsewhere, but we had a 100-piece orchestra in Los Angeles. We had these phenomenal singers all over the world. I used these Polynesian, sort of South Pacific Island singers who brought a new texture because I wanted certain things like the Metcaina are different from the forest tribe, the Omaticaya. So I moved from that glistening gamelan texture, which is what I'd made up on Avatar 1, because that was my role, was doing all that stuff. And I moved to bamboo and anklungs and things like that, because I wanted a different sort of texture. There's none of those sort of glowing bells. And I changed the vocal texture from being this rather hard edge sound that we used in the forest to being a softer, longer texture, which seemed more appropriate to the sea. And there were some conscious decisions about that, about how we made this evolve because it had to, the new score, it's a new film, it has new territory, it has new characters, and that went through the way to, for instance, with Payakan, with his theme. We have this 300-ton Tulkun whale-like creature. But he has this elegance, and there is almost a balletic quality to the way he moves. And so I wanted something that had this elegance, had a sort and an elegiac quality to him. But I also wanted something that actually worked, that there was a reason for it. And that I'd actually wrote initially, Chris Boyes, the lead sound effects designer, and I worked with a woman who was one of the lead whale researchers at UCLA. And she taught us about whale song and how it was generated and so on. And I was looking, because there was a talk for a while that we were going to have Tulkoon singing in the film. Now, that didn't actually end up happening, but I had to work out, right, well, how do they make their sounds? Okay, so how will I make a theme that they could sing? How could I actually make this into something musical? Now, in the end, I've made it using cellos. The cello instrument, cello, solo cello, and French horns tend to be how I used Payakan's theme. But I had to look at the theme, and I ended up thinking about, it's a resonant chamber that you effectively, you're squeezing, you're changing, and therefore it's about the overtones that are created. So I started thinking about the circle of fifths, about the overtone series, effectively, natural harmonic overtones. And then I took it, so I inverted some of those things, so that instead of going, say, C, G, D, I went G, C, D, which gives it this big leap. Bum, 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 and bum, 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 ba, da, 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 da. And I used that idea of these sort of resonant fifths. That became part of it, and it started from the physics of how a whale makes a note, and it's ended up with a sort of like an orchestral theme. But we also I use it for the older Tulkoon. We hear it when, for instance, in the Tulkoon Hunt, I put it in voices for the high female voices sung by the incredible choir Tenebrae, who are just an amazing choir. That one was, I saw that almost as being like the Confutatis from Mozart Requiem, where you have the RDA going off on the chase. And Jim said to me, this has to feel like they're having fun. That this is fun, that, and we're saying this isn't stomping, they're going off for a hunt. So that this has to feel like there's a sort of like, it's hideous, but they think they're off going, having a great time. So I had to give them that. But I looked at them as being the men in the Confutatis. And then I looked at the Tulkoon as being the women. So there's this thing with them, there's all this movement in, and obviously it's completely different. It's a rhythmic action cue for 6.5 minutes. But it was that idea of those two things pushing against each other.
Well, like I said, I really thought the score was a tremendous score. And I know my wife was excited by it as well, because I got to show it to her so she could hear it. And I want to thank you so much for speaking with me, sir. I could go on with talking to you about this for hours, but I know time is short. So I want to thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me, Jeff. And you too.